Vader's Fist, the full history of the 501st Legion. Chapter 1, Genesis of a Battalion. Long before the galaxy knew them as the 501st Legion, before they became the personal hand of Darth Vader, before they swept through Jedi temples and Imperial strongholds, they were simply a battalion, a number, a test. The 501st Clone Battalion began on the oceanic world of Kamino, bred not from love or tradition, but from genetic perfection, scientific rigor, and a need for war. Cloning was an industry on Kamino, and the Grand Army of the Republic was its greatest client. From the moment the first embryos of the 501st were selected, their fate was entwined with the escalating whispers of a war that had not yet begun. Engineered from the unyielding genetic template of Jango Fett, the clones of the 501st were shaped in vat chambers beneath Topoka City. Their formation was closely monitored by both Kaminoan geneticists and elite Republic advisors, notably the Alpha-class ARC troopers, those hand-selected by Jango himself for enhanced individuality, autonomy, and battlefield prowess. The ARC troopers, particularly Alpha 17, were more than instructors, they were architects of a philosophy. Whereas the Kaminoans favored uniformity and obedience, Alpha 17 taught leadership, initiative, and most of all, identity. It was Alpha who introduced names to the numbered ranks, who encouraged his cadets to personalize their armor, to forge identities beyond mere serial codes. It was from Alpha 17's cadre that many of the Grand Army's best clone commanders emerged. Among them, a trooper who would become the soul of the 501st, CT-7567, better known as Rex. The 501st was not like the other units formed during the initial surge of clone production. It was designed to be a spearhead force, a sharp tool used for rapid deployment and high-risk insertions. Its soldiers underwent intensified mental conditioning and training modules, including live-fire combat in zero-G environments, repelling exercises from LAT gunships, and advanced urban warfare scenarios built from real-time holographic feeds of galactic conflict zones. Though officially indistinguishable from other battalions to the Kaminoan record keepers, the Republic Military Command ensured this unit had access to cutting-edge Phase 1 armor even in prototype stages, suits that integrated tighter command link circuitry and more responsive HUD overlays. The Kaminoans engineered the 501st with enhanced aggression, slightly more independence in tactical decision-making, and quicker reflexive responses, subtle genome tweaks that distinguished them, though only slightly from the standard regiments. These changes made them effective, but also more prone to questioning orders when not tempered with strong leadership. Alpha 17 recognized this potential and paired his top graduates with squad-level mentorships that fostered cohesion without sacrificing individuality. Rex, always a quick learner, absorbed this duality, how to balance loyalty with intuition. Under Alpha's guidance, he came to see his men not as tools, but as brothers. When the Clone Wars erupted following the Battle of Geonosis, the Republic scrambled to field its rapidly growing army. The 501st was activated later than the initial waves, giving its troopers more time in training and advanced live combat simulations. As a result, they were one of the most polished units when first deployed. Their initial assignment was under the newly promoted Jedi General Anakin Skywalker, assigned to the 7th Sky Corps. A rising star of the Jedi Order, Skywalker's command style meshed unusually well with the 501st's own disposition. He was unorthodox, emotional, and driven by instinct, qualities not traditionally encouraged by the Jedi High Council, but ones that resonated deeply with the clones bred to think on their feet. Skywalker's approach to leadership created a fertile environment for growth within the 501st. He viewed the clones as individuals, capable, valuable, even noble, and often made tactical decisions that put him on the ground beside them, rather than hovering above from a gunship or holodeble. His bond with Rex, in particular, became legendary. Unlike many Jedi generals, Anakin took personal interest in the training reports, performance metrics, and even field customizations of his troops. He encouraged their independence when others feared it, trusting their ability to adapt and survive. It was a mutual respect forged in fire. The Battle of Christophsis marked the 501st true baptism by war. Tasked with reclaiming the crystalline world from a well-entrenched separatist droid force under General Worm Loathsome, the battalion found itself locked in a brutal siege. Christophsis was not an open battlefield. It was a city of glass spires and urban corridors, where droids held the high ground and ambushed clones with calculated efficiency. The early stages of the battle saw the 501st pinned down in shattered alleyways, suffering heavy losses from vulture droids and tri-droid patrols. But it was in this crucible that they demonstrated what would become their hallmark: adaptability. Rather than retreat, the 501st dug in, using debris and fallen vehicles as makeshift cover. Clone engineers deployed portable shield generators, while recon squads flanked droid encampments under cover of darkness. Rex personally led rooftop incursions to disable enemy sensors, while Skywalker devised an audacious plan to tunnel beneath enemy lines using captured boring equipment. The cityscape became a vertical battlefield, and the clones learned to fight in 3 dimensions. Their armor, still pristine at first deployment, was soon scorched, etched, and painted with kill tallies and squad insignias. The arrival of Ahsoka Tano, Anakin's new Padawan, threw another layer of complexity into the battle. Her youthful arrogance initially clashed with the disciplined professionalism of the clones, but the 501st, ever willing to evaluate merit over rank, came to respect her determination. She led a daring infiltration of a droid command relay, disabling it with explosives planted by clone demolition experts from Torrent Company, a core unit within the 501st. By the battle's end, the Separatists had been driven off-world, and the 501st had earned its first true victory, and its place as a premier strike force. Their tactics at Christophsis would be studied at the Kaminoan academies in later years, and the scars left behind became stories told across mess halls and barracks on every front. The clone who once hesitated during training simulations now led a fire team through collapsing towers. The battalion was no longer just a collection of numbers. It had a name, a reputation, and a symbol. From that point forward, when commanders requested elite clone support, they asked for the 501st by name. Their armor bore it proudly, the bold blue markings along their white plastoid plates, customized but uniform, symbolic of their unity and elite status. Though future wars would see them transition into new armor and face far greater losses, the spirit of the 501st was born in those glimmering streets of Christophsis, among the shattered crystal and the burnt metal. They had proven they were more than experiments, more than soldiers. They were a brotherhood with purpose, and their war was only just beginning. Chapter 2: War on 100 Fronts. As the Clone Wars engulfed the galaxy in a conflict the likes of which hadn't been seen since the ancient hyperspace wars, the 501st Battalion found itself swept from one star system to another in a relentless campaign of attrition. The initial victories, such as Christophsis, were only the beginning. Once the Republic realized the effectiveness and reliability of the 501st, they became a go-to force for the most critical and volatile engagements. As the war expanded, the lines between front and rear blurred, and nowhere was safe. The soldiers of the 501st, bred for war and honed through fire, became hardened instruments of the Republic's will, exacting, adaptable, and increasingly weary of the shifting tides and moral ambiguity that defined the conflict. While the public celebrated heroes and victories, the men in blue-striped armor trudged through mud, metal, and blood on 100 forgotten worlds, their deeds rarely sung. The Battle of Umbara stood as one of the darkest chapters in the unit's early history. Umbara, the Shadow World, lay cloaked in a permanent haze, its twisted terrain bathed in ultraviolet light and pierced by jagged flora that seemed to claw at everything alien. The 501st was deployed alongside the 212th to spearhead the assault on Umbaran separatist positions. Upon arrival, they were stripped of conventional visibility and communications due to the planet's atmospheric interference and jamming arrays. It was an environment hostile not just to flesh, but to the mind. Then came the betrayal, though not in the traditional sense. General Anakin Skywalker was recalled to Coruscant under the pretext of a high-level assignment, and the command of the 501st passed to Jedi General Pong Krell. Tall, four-armed, and imposing, Krell was a basilisk known for his tactical victories and his ruthless disregard for clone levs. Under Krell, the 501st was ordered into wave after wave of frontal assaults, denied reconnaissance and air support, and denied the autonomy they had grown accustomed to under Skywalker. Krell forbade clone-initiated strategy and dismissed all non-Jedi command structure as irrelevant. His tactics were brutal, and the casualty rate soared. Clones who had survived months of hard-fought engagements were now falling by the dozens in minutes. Ambushes and fortified Umbaran positions shredded companies of soldiers without pause. Rex and the other senior troopers protested the suicidal orders, but Krell's authority was absolute. What followed was not just a series of engagements, it was a slow mental unraveling. Exhaustion, confusion, and the gnawing realization that their lives were considered expendable tore at the men's resolve. The final tragedy came when Krell, exploiting the chaos, manipulated a portion of the 501st into attacking fellow clones, disguised and misidentified. Brothers killed brothers, not knowing until the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted. When the truth emerged, that Krell had fallen to the dark side, drawn by visions of power under the coming empire, the 501st was forced to do the unthinkable. Clones Rex, Dogma, and Fives participated in a tribunal, culminating in Krell's execution by firing squad. It was not a moment of triumph, but of burden. Krell had been a Jedi, and executing him fractured the faith many clones had in the Order. More deeply, it shattered the assumption that all Jedi were protectors. From then on, the 501st marched not with blind loyalty, but with open eyes. Umbara left scars far deeper than wounds. It instilled suspicion, haunted dreams, and the persistent ache of guilt. Yet through it all, they endured. Ryloth followed not long after. The 501st was deployed to the southern continent, where resistance cells, led by Cham Syndulla, had managed to destabilize the separatist occupation. The terrain was mountainous, filled with narrow cliff passes and fortified canyons bristling with droid turrets and mines. The clone engineers of Torrent Company, the 501st Backbone, were instrumental in pioneering mobile artillery platforms for the assault. They converted damaged LAT gunships into drop-cradle mortar stations, launching shells with precise coordination from spotters embedded in Twi'lek resistance lines. It was a rare moment of synergy between Republic forces and locals, though even that alliance was strained by cultural misunderstandings and the Twi'lek's deep-seated mistrust of outsiders. In the final push through Rylotha's capital archways, the 501st suffered heavy losses. Droid tri-fighter squadrons intercepted LAT dropships midair, tearing through their hulls with plasma bolts before the clones could even disembark. Yet Torrent Company found a way through. Captain Rex, against orders, led a canyon floor advance, using fallen rock slides as natural cover to bypass the droid gun lines and emerge directly beneath their artillery nests. The assault turned the tide, and though many clones did not survive the charge, Ryloth was freed. The Twi'leks never forgot, and small shrines honoring the blue-striped warriors remain hidden in their villages even decades later. From there, Felucia, a jungle planet dense with towering fungi, carnivorous flora, and unpredictable weather, Felucia was a place that swallowed men. The 501st was sent in to neutralize separatist supply lines that had embedded beneath the canopy. The mission quickly devolved into trench warfare, with droid artillery reducing swaths of the jungle into mired, acidic mud fields. Clone medics operated under constant threat, and the environment bred infections that even Kaminoan vaccines could barely stave off. Torrent Company's ingenuity surfaced again, building makeshift filtration systems from droid parts to purify swamp water, modifying AT-RT legs with spore-resistant coverings, and retrofitting their helmets with fungal filtration masks. They fought side by side with the 327th Star Corps under Aayla Secura, and though she was a capable leader, the strain on morale was evident. The men were beginning to break, some silently, some visibly. There were reports of hallucinations from spore exposure, and many of the soldiers began to name the giant flora around their trenches, as if the jungle itself had become a living enemy. And then Mygeeto, cold, urban, and shattered by artillery fire, Mygeeto's war was waged in glass. The banking world was a separatist stronghold, fortified by automated defenses and droid tanks equipped with beam weapons capable of slicing through buildings. The 501st, alongside Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi's forces, led a charge across the shattered bridges of the city's crystalline surface. It was a war of attrition where bridges collapsed under the weight of too many bodies, where clones rappelled from broken spires and fought from rooftop to rooftop like trench soldiers of an ancient age. It was there that Republic High Command began testing new experimental weapons, thermal imploders and beam drills, entrusting the 501st to deploy them. The resulting shockwaves annihilated enemy defenses, but obliterated entire sections of city block, taking clones and civilians with them. The orders were followed, but not without questioning. By now, the 501st was no longer wide-eyed in their faith. They carried out missions not because they believed in every word from the Senate, but because they believed in each other. The man to their left. The voice on the comm that was who they fought for. The signature of the 501st on the battlefield became a familiar one to Republic tacticians. The use of ADRT walkers, light bipedal units often piloted by specialized recon troopers, became a standard part of their advance. These swift, maneuverable walkers allowed for precise flanking and rapid reaction strikes, especially in terrain where heavier AT-TS were impractical. Torrent Company's operators modified ADRT targeting systems to integrate with LAT support channels, allowing gunships to coordinate airstrikes mid-stride. The LAT gunships, reliable and heavily armed, became flying lifelines, carrying reinforcements, evacuating wounded, delivering supplies, or opening suppressive fire to cover withdrawal. Often, battles would begin with the whine of LAT engines in the distance and the sight of blue-striped clone armor rappelling through the smoke. In the rare moments of respite, the 501st gathered beneath shattered buildings, in dugouts carved from burnt ground, or around makeshift lamps fashioned from droid power cores. They told stories of fallen brothers, passed around datapads filled with old Kaminoan training clips, or simply sat in silence, staring at the stars and wondering if any of this made sense. Camaraderie was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Clone humor was dark, their rituals strange to outsiders, but they had each other. Rex often joined them, never separating himself with rank or distance. The bond between officer and trooper in the 501st was something rarely seen elsewhere in the Grand Army. It was this unity, this absolute dependence on one another, that allowed them to endure. Where others faltered or broke, they adapted, and where others hesitated, they charged. These battles, Umbara, Ryloth, Felucia, Mygeeto, never made the headlines on Coruscant. But in the field, they were everything. The war was not won in grand speeches or Jedi councils. It was fought in the blood-soaked corridors of starships, in the wet soil of alien jungles, in the freezing wind on shattered bridges. And in every one of these places, the 501st stood, not because they were ordered to, but because no one else could. Chapter 3, Brothers in Arms. Long before their first deployment, before the sound of blaster fire echoed in their ears, or the weight of fallen comrades settled into their bones, the clones of the 501st began life as identical templates in the sterile birthing chambers of Tapoka City on Kamino. Rows of gestation pods lined the artificial wombs of the cloning facility, and from the moment their DNA was activated, their lives were calibrated for war. But even in that uniformity, the 501st was being molded into something more. Selected from particular genetic batches, reinforced with experimental behavioral conditioning, and overseen by Alpha-class ARC troopers, the clones of the 501st were not meant to be average foot soldiers. They were intended to be sharp-edged tools in the arsenal of the Republic, efficient, elite, and above all adaptive. And though Kamino was gray and lifeless, the spark that would one day burn brightly in the hearts of the 501st was already beginning to flicker in the storm-lit halls of the training domes. From the earliest stages of their youth, clone cadets destined for frontline deployment were run through an unrelenting gauntlet of training simulations. In Kamino's domed arenas, teams of young clones competed against each other in squad-based challenges that combined combat, strategy, and endurance. The cadets who would become 501st were often selected from top-performing squads, frequently paired or rotated into specialty training programs that emphasized coordination with LAT pilots, ADRT operators, and infiltration teams. Their trainers, a mix of Kaminoan supervisors and ARC trooper instructors like Alpha, 17, emphasized initiative and creativity, traits not typically encouraged in the wider clone ranks. Alpha, 17 in particular, was known for breaking the mold, taking promising squads and pushing them through impossible scenarios, only to reward those who showed ingenuity rather than compliance. The facilities weren't limited to ground tactics. Towering above the ocean surface, zero-gravity modules simulated boarding actions in space. Cadets trained with magnetic boots, firing from unstable surfaces, crawling through shattered mock corridors as alarms screamed around them. These environments bred resilience and mental flexibility. They learned to adapt not only to enemy fire, but to vacuum breaches, equipment failure, and unexpected loss. VR simulation pods, developed in part from Jedi battle meditation feedback loops, allowed squads to experience entire campaigns in compressed time, running full-scale tactical scenarios before they had ever fired a real weapon in battle. By the time they graduated into full troopers, Many had already faced, and survived, simulated siege warfare, ambushes, starship breaches, and even moral decision-making dilemmas. A quietly controversial element embedded in the more advanced VR modules used only on high-tier clones. And yet, it wasn't just their training that set the 501st apart, it was what they did with it. Upon graduation and assignment, the members of the battalion quickly developed an internal culture distinct from other units. While most clones adopted numbers as identifiers, the 501st leaned into nicknames, symbols, and identity formation with rare intensity. Their armor, white and pristine when issued, rarely stayed that way. Blue markings became a signature, first in broad strokes to designate command structure, then in intricate patterns that signaled individual experience, squad affiliation, or fallen brothers remembered. Clones painted kill tallies, handprints, and ancestral Mandalorian sigils onto their chest plates and helmets. Torrent Company, the core of the 501st, was especially known for this, a kind of badge of honor among elite units. Customization extended beyond paint. Helmets were modified with polarized visors, enhanced optics, or even minor voice modulation tweaks. Some integrated scavenged parts from fallen droids or destroyed comms equipment, repurposing them into tactical advantages. A clone's gear wasn't just issued, it was lived in, adjusted, and sometimes handed down. Field medics like Kix carried extra trauma gel patches, while demolitions experts like Hardcase rigged detonation harnesses from surplus battle droid capacitors. This personalization was tolerated by command because it never came at the cost of performance. In fact, it enhanced it. They weren't just soldiers in armor, they were craftsmen of war. Communication within the 501st evolved alongside their identity. Though all clones were trained in Galactic Basic, they developed a nonverbal language of hand signals, helmet taps, and motion cues that allowed squads to coordinate in silence. This evolved into something more complex during their campaigns. Gestures with multiple meanings depending on context, squad-specific signs that outsiders couldn't interpret, even coded clicks transmitted through helmet comms to simulate insect chirps or ambient battlefield noise. These signals saved lives in tight quarters and urban engagements. It was an organic language, born of need and refined by trust. Their social structure, too, shifted beyond Republic regulation. While rank technically determined chain of command, informal leadership often emerged based on merit, personality, or survivability. Veterans of heavy campaigns earned respect, not because of their stripe count, but because of how many men they'd pulled from burning wreckage, or how often they'd stayed behind to cover a retreat. The 501st operated on what they half-jokingly called the law of the field, a blend of military structure and tribal intuition. Captain Rex, though always respectful of orders, often deferred to squad leaders on tactical decisions when it suited the situation. The clones respected him not just because he outranked them, but because he fought beside them, bled with them, and never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. Many of these insights were echoed in post-campaign interviews with troopers like Echo and Fives, both veterans of Domino Squad and early campaigns. Archived logs pulled from Anax's War College simulations feature a rare interview with Fives after the Battle of Kamino. He described the difference between being trained and being tested. "Kamino taught us how to fight," he said, voice level through the vocoder. "The 501st taught us why we fight. It's not about the Republic. It's about the man next to you, the guy who drags you out when the droids cut the ceiling loose. That's who you fight for. The regs don't teach that. Brothers do." Echo, more reserved but no less insightful, once noted during a debrief that standard protocol failed to account for the emotional bandwidth needed to process daily loss. "Every trooper you lose is a part of yourself," he said. "You remember how he laughed in the bunks, how he cursed at the mess food. You carry that, not because it makes you stronger, because it reminds you you're still human. And when you forget that, you're not a soldier anymore. You're a weapon waiting to be pointed." Such bonds didn't end on the battlefield. In between deployments, the 501st carved out rituals that became sacred to their unit. A round of sabacc played with stripped-down cards before a drop. The passing around of a faded hollow image of their first barracks squad, taken on Kamino, faces long dead, remembered in silence. An armor-etching ceremony for every clone promoted, where squadmates added their personal mark to the new ranker's chest plate. These weren't just customs. They were defenses, psychological shields against the dehumanization of war. Other units saw themselves as part of the war machine. The 501st saw themselves as family. What truly set them apart was how fiercely they protected that bond. When new troopers were rotated in, they were not accepted on skill alone. They had to earn it by holding their ground under fire, by pulling their weight during recon, by watching another's back in the chaos of a drop zone. Once accepted, they were treated like blood, but that trust was never automatic. Clone commanders and ARC troopers within the 501st enforced these invisible standards, not through discipline, but through example. Fives once shielded a rookie from a live grenade in the bunkhouse during a separatist boarding action. When asked why, he said, "Because he hadn't earned the right to die alone yet." Even among the wider clone brotherhood, the 501st had a reputation for being tight-knit to the point of isolation. While they worked seamlessly with the 212th or 104th when ordered, they rarely shared downtime with outsiders. They joked that no one understood our brand of crazy but them. This wasn't arrogance, it was armor. The bond they shared had been forged in places like Umbara and Felucia, where darkness and mud swallowed whole squads, and only those who could cling to something deeper than duty survived. And what they clung to was each other. In the end, the culture of the 501st was a paradox. Bred for obedience, yet known for autonomy. Created to be expendable, yet they treated every brother as irreplaceable. Uniform on the outside, unique within. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also artists of survival, poets of violence, engineers of loyalty. Each helmet hid not just a face, but a story, a memory, a song unsung by history, but echoed in the hearts of the few who survived. They were clones, yes, but more than that, they were brothers. And together, they would march into hell without question, because they knew that as long as one blue-striped trooper stood, none of them truly fell. Chapter 4, Siege of Mandalore. The Clone Wars neared their final days, but for the men of the 501st, one of their greatest tests still lay ahead. The Battle of Mandalore would come to define not only the tactical brilliance of the battalion, but the moral and emotional complexity that had grown within its ranks over years of fire and death. Unlike other campaigns waged across the Outer Rim, the Siege of Mandalore was not simply another tactical objective. It was a convergence of fractured loyalties, of shifting leadership, and of dark undercurrents emanating from the heart of the Republic itself. For the 501st, it marked a division not just in structure, but in spirit, a moment where the Brotherhood was asked to choose between orders and honor, and where history would be written not in sweeping victories, but in sacrifices no one would ever fully understand. It began with an unexpected return. Ahsoka Tano, once Padawan to General Anakin Skywalker, re-emerged from the shadows of exile to warn of a threat that had metastasized in the heart of Mandalore. Though no longer a Jedi, her experience, insight, and enduring respect among the clones, especially those of the 501st, meant that her call for aid could not be ignored. Mandalore was on the brink. Former Sith Lord Maul had returned and seized control of the planet through his criminal syndicate, the Shadow Collective, manipulating local politics and igniting civil unrest that had turned the planet into a volatile powder keg. Though officially neutral in the war, Mandalore's instability was a threat the Republic could not afford to overlook. Not with rumors of Maul's growing influence and the possibility of separatist alliances forming in secret. Skywalker, recognizing both the urgency and Ahsoka's unique qualification to lead, offered a solution that would both respect her position outside the Jedi Order and honor the structure of the Republic military. A special detachment of the 501st would be placed under her command, a temporary commission granting her the authority of a commander for the duration of the mission. The men did not hesitate. For most, the loyalty to Ahsoka had never wavered, even after her departure from the Order. In whispered barracks conversations and shared glances during deployments, her name had lingered, always with respect, sometimes with pain. Her return was not seen as strange. It was seen as right. This detachment would become known as the 332nd Company, and though it remained part of the 501st, it developed a symbolic identity of its own. In a gesture of allegiance and honor, the troopers of the 332nd repainted their helmets, each marked with the bright orange pattern of Ahsoka's facial markings, a striking and deeply personal tribute. The image of a clone standing tall in that helmet, a warrior bred for war bearing the mark of a former Jedi who had chosen to walk away from power, came to embody the complicated tapestry of the war's final chapter. These men were not serving under a general chosen for them. They were fighting for someone they believed in, someone who had bled with them, laughed with them, and who had never treated them as anything less than human. Mandalore itself was a fortress of contradictions. Sundari, the domed capital city, stood like a glass spear rising from a land scarred by centuries of internal conflict. Its elegant walkways, vertical towers, and cultural austerity masked the roiling instability beneath. Gar Saxon, Maul's right hand, commanded a fanatical division of Mandalorian warriors clad in modified, crimson-detailed armor, Mandalorians, as they came to be called. Their jetpacks, wrist-mounted weapons, and aerial tactics made them deadly opponents even for clone veterans. From the moment the 332nd Company entered Sundari, urban warfare descended into chaos. Buildings became kill boxes. Aerial duels lit the sky with rocket trails and falling bodies. In narrow corridors, clones fought hand-to-hand with warriors wielding vibroblades and flame units. It was not the droid armies they were used to. This was personal, visceral combat against enemies who thought and adapted just as quickly. The battle took on a shape far different from traditional Republic engagements. Ahsoka operated without Jedi support or Senate oversight. She and Captain Rex directed their forces through the city with grim efficiency, relying on intelligence provided by Bokan Kryze, leader of the Night Owls, and a rebel Mandalorian faction seeking to reclaim the planet from Maul's grasp. It was a precarious alliance, marked by years of distrust between Mandalorians and the Republic, but necessity forged unity. Torrent Company engineers carved breach points through the city's lower levels, collapsing sections to prevent ambushes and rerouting enemy forces toward kill zones. Jetpack assaults were countered with magnetic mines and vertical suppressive fire patterns. Civilians were evacuated under heavy fire, and entire districts changed hands multiple times in a single day. This was not a war of conquest. It was a purge, a surgical strike to decapitate the head of a power too dangerous to let linger. Then came the confrontation with Maul himself. He had not remained in hiding. Instead, he baited Ahsoka and Rex into the lower levels of Sundari's throne sector, orchestrating a trap designed not just to kill but to unravel. He spoke of the future, of Anakin's fate, of the Republic's decay. In the narrow steel catacombs below the palace, Ahsoka faced him alone while Rex coordinated the holding action above. Their duel was not one of brute power but of belief. Maul, desperate to expose the coming darkness, and Ahsoka, desperate to stop him without falling into his spiral of prophecy and madness. When the battle ended and Maul was captured, screaming of Sidious and a plan already in motion, it felt less like a victory and more like a warning unheard. But while blasters still burned on Mandalore, the real war was already being lost. Unbeknownst to those on the front lines, Chancellor Palpatine, Darth Sidious, was orchestrating his final moves. The siege of Mandalore had been allowed to proceed not because it was essential to the Republic's war effort, but because it kept key figures occupied. With Maul drawn out and captured, with Skywalker sent to Coruscant, and with Ahsoka and Rex removed from direct communication with Jedi High Command, the final phase of his plan could unfold without interference. Political strings were pulled in the Senate to ensure that the Republic fleet supported the siege without fully acknowledging it. Orders were routed through secure channels, bypassing traditional oversight. Even within the war room on Coruscant, whispers of confusion circulated. Why Mandalore, and why now? The soldiers of the 332nd, unaware of these machinations, continued their operation with unwavering resolve. They secured key infrastructure, deactivated explosives planted by retreating Mandalorians, and helped restore order to the civilian population. As the city's power grid stabilized and the fires were extinguished, there was a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, when peace seemed possible. Ahsoka, still carrying the burden of exile, stood shoulder to shoulder with Rex, watching the sun rise over a city that had not seen calm in years. It was a victory born not of glory, but of perseverance. A mission completed, a job done well. They did not know it would be their last. For the 501st, and particularly for the men of the 332nd, the siege of Mandalore became the hinge on which everything turned. It was their last campaign fought with conviction, their last operation under a leader they chose to follow, not because of hierarchy or orders, but because of shared belief. In the final debrief logs recorded before the return journey to Coruscant, there is a noticeable shift in tone among the troopers. The voices are proud, yet heavy. They speak not just of tactics and outcomes, but of questions about the enemy's words, about the growing unease in the Jedi ranks, and about what came next. Rex's own report is brief, unusually so, but it ends with a note rarely found in Republic records. If this is what peace feels like, I hope we live to remember it. But the peace would not last. As their ship broke orbit, carrying Maul in a sealed containment field and the weary troopers home, an order was transmitted, one that would shatter everything they had just fought for. Order 66. The final betrayal, crafted not on the battlefield but in the deepest shadows of the Senate, buried in the very programming of the clones who had believed they were free. But that is a story for another time. On Mandalore, before the betrayal, before the fall, the 501st stood divided yet unified, bruised yet proud. The siege had tested them, changed them, and perhaps, for a brief moment, saved them from becoming the tools the Republic had always intended them to be. It was their last stand as brothers before the storm. Chapter 5, Order 66 and the Fall. The transition was instantaneous. For the soldiers of the 501st Legion, loyal sons of Kamino, forged in war and tempered by camaraderie, it began with a flicker of static over their comms, a moment's pause in the blur of routine, and then the transmission that changed everything. In the sterile glow of the Venator-class cruiser Tribunal, returning from the siege of Mandalore, Captain Rex felt it first not as a command, but as a ripple, a crack across the surface of everything he thought he knew. The words came through his neural link with the authority of the Supreme Chancellor, encoded within the deepest layer of every clone's biochip: execute Order 66. It was not a suggestion. It was a trigger. Around him, brothers turned in unison. There was no hesitation in their movement, only purpose, target, Jedi. Enemies of the Republic, terminate with extreme prejudice. But in Rex, something fought back. Perhaps it was the years of loyalty to Ahsoka Tano, or the late-night conversations with Fives about inhibitor chips and buried control protocols. Perhaps it was simply the fire of individuality that had always burned brighter in him than most. Whatever the reason, Rex trembled. His breath hitched, his hand raised to his sidearm, even as his eyes widened with horror. He gave the order to his troops with clenched teeth, fingers twitching against his helmet's controls. Find her! Find Ahsoka! And then, turning away, he fought the compulsion with everything he had left. Ahsoka's escape was chaos carved from instinct and trust. Blasters rang out in the corridor, red bolts slicing the air where seconds before there had only been silence and camaraderie. Her orange-blazoned troopers, the 332nd Company, now surged toward her with lethal intent, their tribute paint now a cruel irony. She deflected shots with desperate precision, retreating into the bowels of the ship. But it was not fear that moved her. It was grief. These men, her men, were no longer in control. Their faces behind the helmets were ones she knew, friends she had fought beside on Mandalore and Christophas, now puppets strung by a hand they could not see. When she finally reached the medbay and removed Rex's helmet, tears gleamed in his eyes as he fought the storm within. "Find Fives," he choked out. "They lied about all of it." With the help of astromech droids and a desperate surgical procedure, Ahsoka located and deactivated the inhibitor chip inside Rex's skull, freeing his mind from the tyranny of Order 66. It came not with relief, but with agony. When Rex awoke, his first words were not thanks, but apologies. He knew what had happened to the rest of the 501st. His brothers, good men, brave and loyal, had been turned into executioners, and the war that had defined their existence had turned on itself in the most monstrous way possible. Elsewhere on Coruscant, the remainder of the 501st Legion carried out one of the darkest operations in galactic history. Under direct command of Lord Vader, still Anakin Skywalker in body, but no longer in spirit, the Blue-Striped Legion assembled at the base of the Jedi Temple. Records indicate a full deployment. Over 200 clone troopers support LAT gunships, AT-RTS equipped for urban combat, and heavy ordnance detachments. The temple's defenses, normally redundant in the heart of the capital, had been stripped back after years of relative peace. Security systems recognized clone signatures as friendly. The massacre was not an invasion. It was an execution. The temple guard resisted first. Yellow-bladed pikes ignited in the entry hall, and for a moment the ancient sanctum became a war zone. But the clones were precise, relentless, methodical. Holocams recorded squads breaching meditation chambers, archives, even the creche. The youngest Jedi, Padawans, initiates, even toddlers, were not spared. Troopers moved in coordinated patterns, sweeping rooms, clearing halls, reporting back in cold military code. Sector 2 secured. No survivors. The horror lay not only in the violence, but in the silence. The clones, once so full of banter, personality, and brotherhood, moved like ghosts now, their voices flat, their actions surgical. It was as if something had been erased, replaced with a program that left only function behind. In an internal report recovered years later by rebel intelligence, a clone commander described the operation in stark, chilling language. Target confirmation, multiple Jedi non-combatants. Engagement duration, 47 minutes. Civilian resistance, none. Orders executed. The name on the report was Apo, once a decorated officer in the 501st, now the face of its darkest day. What made the temple assault uniquely tragic was not simply the loss of life, but the profound betrayal it represented. These were men who had bled beside the Jedi, who had laughed with them in mess halls, shared battlefields on distant worlds, and trusted them with their lives. For 3 years, the Jedi and the clones had been inseparable. And in a single night, that bond was severed with a single order. Not by rage or choice, but by design. For the clones who survived that night and began to regain fragments of their identity, the psychological toll was immense. Many did not even recall the massacre in full, only flashes, distorted images, and the echoes of screams in firelit corridors. Others, particularly those like Rex who had removed their chips, carried the memory with unbearable clarity. The guilt of what they had done, or what they had been forced to do, hung over them like a shroud. A few tried to find solace in the idea that they had been controlled, that it wasn't their choice. But most knew deep down that something had broken inside them and nothing would ever restore it. As the Republic fell and the Empire rose from its ashes, the 501st was among the first military units to be formally integrated into the new order. Their transition was swift and brutal. Colors were stripped from their armor, now pure white and sterile under Imperial regulation. The sigils and personal marks that had once defined their individuality were painted over or forbidden. Custom mods were deactivated, and unit nicknames, Torrent Company 332nd, vanished from official records. They were not brothers anymore. They were assets. Lord Vader took direct control of the 501st, reshaping it into a feared instrument of terror and enforcement. Where once they had been protectors, they became hunters. Jedi who had escaped the Purge were tracked across the stars. Each deployment came without public record or Senate oversight. Entire towns were razed. Archives were erased. The 501st became a myth, a warning whispered in the dark, Vader's fist. No longer heroes, no longer remembered as soldiers who had bled for the Republic, they became symbols of the Empire's absolute reach. And though many of the original clones were eventually rotated out, replaced by conscripts and enlisted stormtroopers, the core of the battalion lingered. Those who remained did so out of loyalty, confusion, or sheer inertia. They were war dogs with no battlefield left, shadows of the men they had once been. Rex and a handful of others, Wolf, Gregor, and a few more, chose another path. Freed from their chips, they vanished into the outer systems, hiding from the Empire and from their own pasts. But the 501st marched on, a hollowed legion marching in lockstep under the gaze of a man they no longer recognized. And in the silence of their barracks, in the cold gleam of their polished armor, there were still moments when they remembered. The orange-marked helmets, the laughter in a gunship, the name Ahsoka. They remembered Christophas, Umbara, Mandalore. They remembered being soldiers of the Republic. And then they would rise, unspoken, and march into the next mission. The fall did not happen in a moment. It happened in fragments, each piece slipping away until all that remained was duty. And yet, buried in the memory of every 501st clone, there was a time when they were more than enforcers. They were brothers, and for a while, they believed they were fighting for something that mattered. Chapter 6. The 501st Becomes Imperial. The Republic was dead, and from its carefully orchestrated collapse rose a machine of order and fear. For the men of the 501st, who had once marched beneath the crest of the Grand Army with purpose etched into their armor and brotherhood in their veins, the transformation into the Imperial Legion was not a singular moment of revelation, but a slow erosion of identity. In the wake of Order 66 and the massacre of the Jedi, the galaxy reeled, but the 501st moved forward under new banners, with the same blue-striped armor, now worn with silence rather than pride. The transition into the Imperial era came not with fanfare, but with new protocols, new expectations, and an understanding that the world they had fought to protect was no longer the one they served. Project Warmantle, a classified initiative birthed in the final days of the Clone Wars, was the instrument of that change. Overseen by Imperial bureaucrats and enforced by the highest levels of command, Warmantle was designed to systematically phase out the clone army. The clones, bred for loyalty to the Republic and efficient wartime service, were now seen as relics, genetically programmed tools of a bygone era. The Empire no longer wanted warriors with opinions or memories. It wanted enforcers, expendable and moldable. Recruitment centers sprang up across the core and mid-rim, training vast waves of human conscripts pulled from Imperial loyal worlds. These Stormtroopers were not clones, but citizens re-educated to believe in the purity of the Empire, drilled with doctrine instead of experience, and uniform in their belief that service was obedience. For the 501st, this meant reclassification. Their identity as a clone battalion was erased from official records. They were now designated the 501st Imperial Legion, a specialized stormtrooper division under the direct authority of Lord Vader himself. The blue paint vanished, their unique markings scrubbed away. The clone designation codes that once denoted brothers in arms were replaced by serial numbers without context, stripped of history. But not all the clones were removed at once. Veterans remained, particularly within elite units. The Empire recognized, at least for a time, the superiority of clone-trained soldiers in high-risk operations. And so the 501st persisted, a corps of veterans surrounded by newly minted stormtroopers, many of whom lacked the combat seasoning to understand the weight of the armor they wore. At the heart of their new existence stood Darth Vader. He was no longer the charismatic, impulsive Jedi general they had once followed into the fire. Gone was the man who bantered with Captain Rex over tactics, who led from the front with lightsaber blazing and a wordless sense of conviction. In his place was a black-clad specter, a figure of terror and silence whose presence alone could still an entire command post. His voice came filtered through a vocoder that erased emotion, and his orders were delivered with the precision of a machine. But the clones, particularly the older ones who had once called him General Skywalker, recognized the rhythm of his movements, the fury in his attacks. Some whispered that he had been changed, not destroyed. That Skywalker still lived within the armor. But they never said it aloud. To question Vader was to court death. Vader's command style was absolute. He did not tolerate hesitation, and he demanded perfection. But unlike the detached officers of the Imperial bureaucracy, he understood war. He knew what it meant to charge into blaster fire, to bleed and burn and hold the line when everything else collapsed. His expectations were brutal, but clear. If a mission failed, there were consequences. If a soldier faltered, there was no mercy. But success earned continued existence, and for the 501st, now a blade in Vader's hand, it was enough. They followed him because they understood the alternative. They respected him not out of love, but out of awe. Where others saw a monster, they saw purpose. The 501st Imperial Legion quickly became the spear point of the Jedi Purge. With the remaining Jedi scattered across the galaxy, hiding on remote worlds and among sympathetic populations, the Empire needed an elite force to root them out, efficient, relentless, and familiar with Jedi tactics. The 501st, having fought beside Jedi for years, were uniquely suited to this role. But that familiarity also posed a threat. Many of the clones still carried memories, faces, names, bonds forged in war and camaraderie. To eliminate these remnants of the past, the Empire began a reconditioning initiative designed to strip all lingering Jedi loyalty from the clone ranks. Imperial doctrine was imposed with unrelenting force. Clones were subjected to psychological programming, daily briefings of Imperial propaganda, and mandatory indoctrination sessions. Holovids demonized the Jedi as traitors, manipulators, and enemies of peace. Scenes from Order 66 were replayed in training rooms, reframed to show the clones as saviors of the galaxy, rather than instruments of mass betrayal. Internal affairs operatives were embedded within units to observe behavior, note dissension, and report suspected emotional instability. Some clones resisted the process and were quietly reassigned to penal squads, placed in cryostasis, or simply disappeared. But many others, wearied by years of war and desperate for clarity, embraced the simplicity of the new order. The past was pain. The present was structure. The Empire offered order, and for soldiers bred for obedience, that was often enough. Missions against Jedi survivors became the Legion's new reality. On Tula, the 501st deployed in sub-zero temperatures to hunt Jedi Master Hunter, who had rallied native Tal's warriors into a defensive ring in the glacial canyons. The clone veteran squads executed the assault in total silence, moving through blizzards with infrared visors and thermite charges. When Hunter was cornered, he pleaded for dialogue, for understanding. The reply was a blaster bolt through his chest. On Mon Cala, underwater battles raged as Jedi Knight Farandre attempted to hide among the coral cities of the Mon Calamari. The 501st adapted, utilizing aquatic walkers and depth-capable armor, breaching domes and neutralizing resistance with surgical precision. Dre was captured alive, handed over to Vader, and never seen again. The Legion left behind only ruin and silence. Each campaign pushed the clones further from what they had once been. There were no victory celebrations, no debriefs that honored the fallen. When a clone died, his number was retired, not his name. No armor was etched with his memory. The camaraderie that had once defined the 501st eroded under the weight of Imperial efficiency. Veterans kept to themselves, quiet in the barracks, their stories shared only in whispers. The younger conscripts, bred not on Kamino but on core world colonies, could not understand the depth of loss that hung over the Legion. They saw Vader as a god, not a general. They followed orders without question, but lacked the experience, the instinct, the soul of the war-bred. Still, fragments of the old 501st remained. In the quiet moments before deployment, some clones would pause before their lockers, running a finger along the seam where once blue paint had shone. Others kept encrypted data chips containing footage from the Clone Wars, battles, briefings, even old holos of Skywalker and Ahsoka. It was not rebellion, it was memory, and in the Empire, memory was dangerous. Despite everything, the 501st Imperial Legion continued to excel. Their precision, their discipline, and their loyalty made them the standard by which other Stormtrooper legions were judged. But to those who looked closer, to those who had seen them before, something had changed. They were no longer the sons of the Republic. They were tools. Beautiful, terrible, efficient tools in the hands of a regime that saw them not as heroes, but as disposable. And so they marched on, into the dark corners of the galaxy, into forgotten temples and burning forests, through the vacuum of derelict cruisers and the ruins of once proud cities. They did not question, they did not mourn, they executed, and behind every step, every order, every shot fired, was the towering presence of Vader, the symbol of what they had become. Not brothers, not defenders, but enforcers, the fist of the Empire, the 501st. Chapter 7, Purge Troopers and Black Ops. In the decades that followed the fall of the Republic, the 501st Imperial Legion transformed from an elite Stormtrooper battalion into something far more sinister, something feared across every sector of the Empire. No longer merely soldiers, they became phantoms of war, deployed not to hold ground or liberate planets, but to erase history. In the shadow of the Inquisitorius and under the black mantle of Darth Vader's command, the 501st birthed a new breed of enforcer, the Purge Troopers. These were not the same men who had marched under Anakin Skywalker, who had fought side by side with Jedi and mourned brothers lost on muddy fields. These were reconditioned veterans, brutalized by doctrine, enhanced with new armor, and instructed in the art of extermination. The clone beneath the helmet no longer mattered. The mission did. The Purge Trooper variants were unlike anything deployed during the Clone Wars. Initially drawn from surviving Phase 2 clone veterans and later from specialized human Stormtrooper recruits, Purge Troopers wore jet black armor, plated with reactive composite materials, designed to resist lightsaber strikes and sustain minimal kinetic damage from close-range combat. Their visors were tinted crimson and equipped with enhanced spectral tracking, capable of detecting minor force-related fluctuations, biometric anomalies linked to Jedi respiration patterns and telekinetic signatures. Most carried heavy vibroblades, repeater rifles, and electrostaffs modified to withstand sustained contact with energy blades. Some even used experimental neural inhibitors designed to destabilize force abilities in close proximity, although such tech was unreliable and classified as highly unstable. Their missions took them deep into the forgotten corners of the galaxy. Jedi enclaves that had survived the initial purge were prioritized for eradication. On Ossus, a Jedi refuge hidden within the ruins of an ancient library was stormed by the 501st under blackout conditions. Intelligence suggested the presence of surviving archivists and Padawans, scholars, not warriors. But the Legion did not differentiate. They breached through the mountain's cave systems, using seismic charges to bypass force barriers. The operation lasted 7 hours, resulting in the deaths of over 30 Jedi and the destruction of records dating back to the Great Hyperspace War. On the surface, it was logged as a victory. In the classified after-action reports, however, troopers described screams echoing through stone corridors and firelight flickering off frescoes thousands of years old. They didn't record casualties. They recorded erasure. The Battle of Kessel, long buried in the depths of the Imperial Archive and referenced only in coded dispatches from Compner intelligence, stands as one of the most brutal examples of the 501st Black operations. Rebel-aligned Jedi survivors had taken shelter in the spice mines, building a covert base beneath the cover of slave revolts and smuggler interference. Vader ordered a full deployment. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The 501st dropped into the mine shafts with thermal detonators and flamethrowers, collapsing tunnels and igniting vaporized spice into deadly firestorms. Jedi combatants fought back, leading prisoners in a desperate last stand that saw entire corridors sealed off with the Force, sacrificial holds carved into the stone to hold off the tide. But one by one they fell. When it was over, the only sound in the mines was the hiss of cooling rock and the shuffle of boots through ash. No survivors, no records, no mercy. Operation Nightfall 2, an unofficial codename whispered among the ranks, took place on the jungle moon of Parnassus Prime. Rumors of a hidden Jedi conclave had reached the ears of the Inquisitorius, and Vader dispatched the 501st with a detachment of Inquisitors in support. The mission was unique, coordinated strikes across 3 separate temples, each protected by natural barriers and ancient defenses. The clones fought alongside Force-wielding Inquisitors who treated them as tools rather than comrades. They breached arcane structures and dismantled relics with blunt force, often burning sacred texts and destroying memory crystals before their contents could be transmitted off-world. It was not just a military operation, it was a cleansing cultural and spiritual, designed to ensure that the Jedi Order would never again rise. In the final report, Vader's voice is noted only once. Nothing remains. But perhaps the most disturbing missions the 501st undertook were not those against surviving Jedi warriors, but those involving Force-sensitive children. After the rise of the Inquisitorius, the Empire began actively tracking younglings born after the Purge, those too young to have ever trained at the temple but still marked by the Force. The program, codenamed Harvester, assigned sections of the 501st to accompany Inquisitors to remote settlements, orphanages, and even noble houses suspected of harboring Force users. In many cases, the children were taken alive and transported to Fortress Inquisitorius on Nur. In others, if resistance was met or if orders deemed the subject unstable, they were terminated. One redacted file from Taris describes an entire township being declared corrupted by Force sympathies and subjected to orbital bombardment. No witnesses, no questions. Darth Vader maintained a personal kill squad within the 501st, an inner cadre of troopers known only by numerical designations. These men, silent, faceless, surgically efficient, acted as his shadow across the galaxy. When Senator Bail Organa's diplomatic freighter, the Tantive 4, was intercepted above Tatooine, it was this squad who boarded first. While the wider Empire would credit the capture of the vessel to standard Stormtroopers, internal footage showed black armored veterans moving ahead of the ranks, clearing compartments with practiced ease. They executed security staff with stun sabers and placed explosives on escape pods before the main contingent even arrived. Their presence was never acknowledged in public reports. Their identities were never listed. But those who studied the footage, long after the fact, recognized the old tactics. These were not new recruits. These were clones, 501st born, 501st bred. The truth of their operations has been obscured by layers of redaction and deception. Data logs scrubbed, whole recordings looped or deleted. In rare moments, fragments surface, battle cams found on downed lots, helmets recovered from crash sites, whispered tales from former officers who defected to the rebellion. One such recording, unearthed from an encrypted Imperial vault after the Battle of Endor, shows a squad of 501st troopers moving through a monastery on Jedha. The monks plead. The troopers respond in silence. The sound of ignition, the flash of fire, then static. For the surviving clones still within the 501st, Black Ops became routine. Missions came with no briefings, no explanations, just coordinates and a time. Orders were encoded directly into neural implants. They stopped asking why. They stopped hoping for redemption. Some held on to rituals, cleaning weapons a certain way, scratching tally marks into their boots, pressing fingertips to the inside of their chest plates before each drop. They didn't talk about it, they just did it, like it meant something, like it kept them human. Inquisitors came and went, often with arrogance and disdain, treating the clones as disposable assets. But there was a strange synergy in their shared detachment. Both were tools of Vader. Both were broken pieces of something larger, once Jedi, once soldiers, now ghosts. When the missions ended, the troopers returned to their holding quarters, faces unseen, thoughts unspoken. There were no medals, no names listed in the data cores. The Empire didn't need heroes. It needed shadows. And so the 501st continued, one mission at a time, through fire and silence, through secrets and blood. They became the erasers of memory, the end of questions. The Jedi were gone, their temples ash, their names struck from every star chart and databank. But in the dark, in the places the Empire feared to admit existed, the 501st still walked. And the whisper of their approach, the crunch of ash beneath a boot, the hum of a vibroblade drawn in silence, was all the warning the galaxy would ever receive. Chapter 8, Rebellion Rising. By the time the sparks of rebellion began to crackle across the galaxy, the 501st was no longer the legion of brothers it had once been. The clones, once the backbone of the battalion and the heart of its legacy, had faded into memory. Those who had not perished in battle or vanished into exile had either aged out of service or been quietly retired by the Imperial military command. The lifespan acceleration built into their genetic structure meant that many of the original veterans could no longer meet the physical standards demanded of them, and even those who could were often deemed a liability. Too experienced, too opinionated, too hard to control. In their place came wave after wave of human conscripts and academy-trained stormtroopers, raised under the boot of the Empire, fed a diet of propaganda, and molded into tools of rigid obedience. Yet despite the changing faces beneath the helmets, the name of the 501st retained its power. Its reputation, built in the fires of the Clone Wars and sharpened during the Jedi Purge, meant something more than fear. It meant results. And so the standard remained, upheld by merciless training, an unforgiving command culture, and a lingering ghost of the past that stalked every corridor of their barracks. The Galactic Civil War was not a conflict defined by fronts and formations, but by flare-ups, infiltration, and insurrection. Unlike the grand battles of the Clone Wars, where armies met across continents, the rebellion emerged like rot within the walls of the Empire itself, cell by cell, world by world. The 501st, now an amalgam of legacy protocols and Imperial doctrine, was deployed across these flashpoints, tasked with extinguishing insurgency before it could spread. The suppression of Raltier was among the first major actions of the Legion during this era, and it set the tone for the grim work to come. A former core world banking center, Raltier had been deemed loyal, until word of mass arrests, student uprisings, and unauthorized transmissions revealed a hidden network of dissent. The 501st was sent not to investigate, but to dismantle. Civil unrest was met with armored patrols, checkpoints were established overnight, and curfews enforced with stun batons and blaster fire. The Stormtroopers moved street to street, raiding universities, broadcasting stations, and medical centers. Rebel sympathizers were rounded up and disappeared. What few Jedi remnants had survived the early Purge had long since gone to ground, but the ideology of resistance had taken root, and it was more dangerous than any lightsaber. On Lothal, a backwater world dismissed by most as a minor industrial hub, the 501st encountered one of its most persistent thorns in the form of Phoenix Squadron, a nascent rebel cell marked by unusually high levels of coordination and unpredictability. Though the world was technically under control of the Imperial Security Bureau and the Tarkin Initiative, the 501st was dispatched in specialized detachments to root out the insurgents and reinforce compromised garrisons. The terrain of Lothal, with its open plains, jagged canyons, and sprawling undercity, made traditional stormtrooper tactics ineffective. As a result, 501st operators adapted, returning to the infiltration drills and field ingenuity once practiced by clone recon squads. Ambushes became the new standard, with squads deploying from low-altitude dropships and repulsor sleds in dead silence, sealing escape routes before launching coordinated sweeps. But Phoenix Squadron was clever, mobile, and had something the Empire couldn't replicate: hope. Even when caught, they fought with a desperation that exceeded their numbers. Clones had once fought for each other, The rebels fought for something more, and that made them dangerous. The mission to Kashyyyk was different. There, the 501st returned to a battlefield familiar from the Clone Wars, but nothing was as they remembered. The Wookiees, once uneasy allies of the Republic, had long since risen against their Imperial oppressors, driven into slavery or forced into hiding deep within the shadowed jungles. The 501st operated in tandem with Imperial mining divisions and Trandoshan mercenaries, enforcing resource quotas and crushing guerrilla resistance. It was a bitter campaign. The Wookiees fought with raw strength and intimate knowledge of the terrain, ambushing supply convoys and sabotaging refineries. The 501st responded with overwhelming force, using incendiary tactics and deforestation drills to strip away the cover of the jungle. Under orders from Vader himself, orbital strikes were authorized on ancient Rasher trees believed to shelter resistance leaders. Thousands of years of natural growth were erased in hours. The official logs declared victory, but among the 501st, the mission was spoken of only in silence. Even the newer recruits, hardened by Imperial indoctrination, felt the weight of what they'd done. Not all missions were conventional. As the rebellion expanded, the need for intelligence and preemptive action grew. The 501st was increasingly used for deep infiltration operations, their elite training repurposed for clandestine enforcement. In one such mission, a 501st strike team was inserted into the corporate towers of Gorman, disguised as ISB operatives, intercepting high-value communications between rebel financiers and former separatist guild leaders. The leak of those files resulted in mass arrests and the dismantling of a dozen rebel funding channels. Another operation on Anaxes involved a full planetary lockdown after a defector leaked starship schematics to the rebels. The 501st coordinated with naval intelligence to shut down all outgoing transmissions, established planetary-wide curfews, and conducted biometric sweeps of the capital city. Thousands were interrogated, hundreds vanished. The leak was traced back to a communications officer within the Imperial Academy, a 17-year-old cadet executed without trial. The mission succeeded. The fear it generated succeeded even more. As the clone legacy continued to fade, new blood began to rise within the 501st. One such figure was Commander Voltas, a graduate of the Coralag Academy, who quickly rose through the ranks not because of his charisma or combat record, but because of his absolute alignment with Imperial philosophy. Voltas maintained strict discipline within the Legion, reinstituting physical training that bordered on punishment and personally overseeing the psychological screening of every trooper under his command. He encouraged detachment, removed names from squad lists, and forbade personal symbols on armor. He considered the clone legacy a weakness, an artifact of a failed ideology. And yet, even he recognized the necessity of excellence. He allowed veteran advisors, former ARC-trained clones like 2270 Strake and 0308 Wraith, to oversee the elite conditioning of new squad leaders, ensuring that the methods which once defined the 501st were not entirely lost. Other specialists emerged, forged in battle rather than bred in vats. Sergeant Adrian Malice, a demolitions expert from the foundry districts of Corellia, introduced advanced siege tactics into the Legion's doctrine, including the use of microcharges to breach subterranean facilities and hovermine dispersal for rapid crowd control. Lieutenant Senna Torsal, a linguistics prodigy, established the first cross-sectoral infiltration unit trained in local dialects and cultural mimicry, allowing the 501st to operate in populated zones without detection. These individuals, shaped not by cloning tanks but by raw survival and merit, brought new skills into the Legion. But they lacked the shared memory of Kamino. They wore the armor well, but they never truly understood the weight it carried. Still, the 501st endured. Even as the rest of the Stormtrooper Corps devolved into mediocrity, undisciplined, poorly trained, and rushed into service to meet the demands of a growing rebellion, the 501st remained sharp. Their assignments were more dangerous, their survival rate more brutal, and their operational standards higher. It wasn't loyalty that kept them alive. It was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of Vader. Fear of becoming irrelevant in a galaxy that no longer remembered who they were. Encounters with cells like Saw Gerrera's partisans tested that edge. On Jedha, the 501st clashed with partisan extremists in subterranean catacombs beneath the city, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat that left dozens dead on both sides. Unlike Phoenix Squadron, the partisans did not fight for unity, they fought for revenge. Traps were laced with beradium. Civilians were used as shields. When the smoke cleared, the victory was hollow. The entire district had to be sealed and declared contaminated. The bodies remained buried, both literally and officially. Despite the savagery, the 501st rarely failed in its objectives. They were the fist that closed when the Empire pointed, the scalpel when precision was needed, the hammer when terror was the goal. And though the names had changed, though the voices behind the helmets no longer carried the same inflection, the legacy endured. Veterans whispered of a time when they had fought for something more. Recruits saw themselves as the best because their patches said so. The truth was that the 501st was no longer about brotherhood. It was about survival, about efficiency, about reputation. Not all missions were conventional. As the rebellion expanded, the need for intelligence and preemptive action grew. The 501st was increasingly used for deep infiltration operations, their elite training repurposed for clandestine enforcement. In one such mission, a 501st strike team was inserted into the corporate towers of Gorman, disguised as ISB operatives, intercepting high-value communications between rebel financiers and former separatist guild leaders. The leak of those files resulted in mass arrests and the dismantling of a dozen rebel funding channels. Another operation on Anaxes involved a full planetary lockdown after a defector leaked starship schematics to the rebels. The 501st coordinated with naval intelligence to shut down all outgoing transmissions, established planetary-wide curfews, and conducted biometric sweeps of the capital city. Thousands were interrogated. Hundreds vanished. The leak was traced back to a communications officer within the Imperial Academy, a 17-year-old cadet executed without trial. The mission succeeded. The fear it generated succeeded even more. As the clone legacy continued to fade, new blood began to rise within the 501st. One such figure was Commander Voltas, a graduate of the Coralag Academy, who quickly rose through the ranks not because of his charisma or combat record, but because of his absolute alignment with Imperial philosophy. Voltas maintained strict discipline within the Legion, reinstituting physical training that bordered on punishment and personally overseeing the psychological screening of every trooper under his command. He encouraged detachment, removed names from squad lists, and forbade personal symbols on armor. He considered the clone legacy a weakness, an artifact of a failed ideology. And yet, even he recognized the necessity of excellence. He allowed veteran advisors, former ARC-trained clones like 2270 Strake and 0308 Wraith, to oversee the elite conditioning of new squad leaders, ensuring that the methods which once defined the 501st were not entirely lost. Other specialists emerged, forged in battle rather than bred in vats. Sergeant Adrian Malice, a demolitions expert from the foundry districts of Corellia, introduced advanced siege tactics into the Legion's doctrine, including the use of microcharges to breach subterranean facilities and hovermine dispersal for rapid crowd control. Lieutenant Senator Sal, a linguistics prodigy, established the first cross-sectoral infiltration unit trained in local dialects and cultural mimicry, allowing the 501st to operate in populated zones without detection. These individuals, shaped not by cloning tanks but by raw survival and merit, brought new skills into the Legion. But they lacked the shared memory of Kamino. They wore the armor well, but they never truly understood the weight it carried. Still, the 501st endured. Even as the rest of the Stormtrooper Corps devolved into mediocrity, undisciplined, poorly trained, and rushed into service to meet the demands of a growing rebellion, the 501st remained sharp. Their assignments were more dangerous, their survival rate more brutal, and their operational standards higher. It wasn't loyalty that kept them alive. It was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of Vader. Fear of becoming irrelevant in a galaxy that no longer remembered who they were. Encounters with cells like Saw Gerrera's partisans tested that edge. On Jeddah, the 501st clashed with partisan extremists in subterranean catacombs beneath the city, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat that left dozens dead on both sides. Unlike Phoenix Squadron, the partisans did not fight for unity, they fought for revenge. Traps were laced with beradium. Civilians were used as shields. When the smoke cleared, the victory was hollow. The entire district had to be sealed and declared contaminated. The bodies remained buried, both literally and officially. Despite the savagery, the 501st rarely failed in its objectives. They were the fist that closed when the Empire pointed, the scalpel when precision was needed, the hammer when terror was the goal. And though the names had changed, though the voices behind the helmets no longer carried the same inflection, the legacy endured. Veterans whispered of a time when they had fought for something more. Recruits saw themselves as the best because their patches said so. The truth was that the 501st was no longer about brotherhood. It was about survival, about efficiency, about reputation. Chapter 9, Scarif to Endor. By the time the Galactic Empire constructed its apex weapon, the Death Star, Vader's fist had become more myth than military unit, a name spoken with awe or fear depending on which side of the blaster one stood. The 501st Imperial Legion had evolved into a precision instrument of terror, reserved for assignments of the utmost secrecy and lethality. No longer deployed in wide planetary invasions, their role had shifted to one of guardianship, intelligence enforcement, and last resort interventions. Now, in the Empire's twilight years, they stood as the final sentinels between insurgency and obliteration. Scarif would mark the beginning of the end, and Endor would finish the story entirely. Scarif was more than a remote archive world. It was the heart of the Empire's darkest ambition. Beneath its glittering blue skies and towering data citadel lay Project Stardust, the codename for the Death Star Initiative, housing schematics, research files, and thousands of classified black projects. While Krennic's elite Death Troopers formed the immediate security presence around the compound, elements of the 501st were embedded within the broader perimeter, tasked with monitoring Imperial staff, vetting supply shipments, and overseeing orbital docking clearances. In a facility where even minor intelligence leaks could destroy decades of effort, the 501st reputation for incorruptibility and execution without hesitation was a necessary deterrent. Interactions between the Death Troopers and the 501st were tense at times. Where the Death Troopers were precision-born assassins bred from the Intelligence Division's darkest programs, the 501st were hardened field veterans who had earned their blood in war rather than labs. Despite the unspoken rivalry, there was mutual respect. Both operated in the shadows, both followed orders few others could stomach, and both stood unflinching when the battle came. The assault on Scarif by rebel forces was swift, brutal, and unexpected. When the alarm klaxons echoed through the citadel and the shielding array was breached, elements of the 501st deployed from high-orbit gunships in coordinated response waves. Troopers hit the beach under heavy fire, blue and white armor muddied by sand and blood. The rebels had committed everything to this strike, a desperate, suicidal gamble to steal the Death Star plans. The 501st responded as they always had, without panic, without mercy, clearing platforms and drop zones in precise fire teams, pushing through the labyrinthine base levels to secure compromised data streams. They sealed off high-clearance vaults and deployed jamming nodes to block uplinks, but it wasn't enough. The files were extracted. The transmission was sent. By the time the 501st secured the upper command floors, the damage was done. The information had escaped. What followed was fire. The Death Star's superlaser incinerated Scarif's surface, erasing all trace of the failure. Troopers, data, structures, everything. Of the 501st present, no names were listed among survivors. Officially, none were even deployed. The Legion's presence was removed from the manifest. A blank page in history, but whispers among officers suggested otherwise, that a detachment had survived long enough to log the breach, to identify the vessel that fled, and to send that data straight to Vader's personal flagship. The hunt for the Rebel High Command began immediately. Vader led it personally, and the 501st followed him like hounds on a scent trail. Every intercepted transmission, every captured operative, every fragment of data was processed and acted on. The search for the one who had stolen the plans, the pilot, the agent, the princess, became an obsession. When the Tantive 4 was captured above Tatooine, the 501st was there, deployed before Stormtroopers touched the hull. They moved through the corridors with the same efficiency that had defined them since the Temple March. Hull by hull, they swept the ship clean. Files were seized, officers interrogated, and escape pods destroyed. The capture of Leia Organa was a political trophy, but the loss of the stolen plans remained a stain. Once again, the 501st's success had come a heartbeat too late. And now, the Empire's most dangerous weapon stood exposed. From that point on, the Legion was pulled deeper into the rebel conflict. Though records are fragmented, Legends-era transmission logs and field reports suggest that splinter squads of the 501st participated in engagements across the galaxy, including the Battle of Hoth. In the freezing white wastes of Echo Base, 501st Snowtroopers, clad in specialized climate armor, led the charge through rebel trenches and collapsed ice caverns. Their precision in sub-zero combat was noted in internal commendations, particularly their disabling of shield generators and capture of critical supply caches. Some reports claim that elements of the Legion engaged rebel commandos deep within the icy tunnels, losing dozens to explosives and collapses, but preventing the escape of critical data cores. Though the rebels escaped with key leadership intact, the damage to their infrastructure was severe, and the 501st actions delayed the Alliance's regrouping by months. Bespin followed, and with it, one of the most mysterious and classified episodes of the Legion's post-Clone Wars history. While Vader's duel with Luke Skywalker atop the Cloud City gantries is well known in Rebel history, what remains less documented are the coordinated sweeps conducted by 501st detachments throughout the facility. While Stormtroopers handled crowd control and evacuation logistics, the 501st hunted the source of the information leak that had led them there in the first place. According to decrypted field logs, a rogue communications officer embedded in the Tabana Mining Guild had been relaying coordinates to the rebel fleet. The 501st moved through the sublevels, clearing engineering bays and substation nodes with cold efficiency. Dozens of suspected informants were executed, and the main communications tower was destroyed in what was described as a containment measure. Though the rebels again escaped, the informant network on Bespin was shattered. But it would all lead to Endor. There, in the dense forests beneath the shadow of the second Death Star, the 501st would make its final stand. Elements of the Legion had been deployed as part of the garrison stationed on the Moon to protect the shield generator complex, vital to the space station's defense. Though the majority of surface forces were standard Stormtrooper units, the 501st presence, while minimized, was significant. These were Vader's men, after all. They were not sent for crowd control. They were sent because the shield had to hold. No one, not even Tarkin or Palpatine, trusted the rank and file to maintain that security under threat. But even Vader's fist could not hold back a rebellion swelling with conviction and sacrifice. The battle that unfolded in the forests of Endor was a catastrophe. Outnumbered, ambushed, and outmaneuvered by a combination of rebel commandos and native Ewok forces, the Imperial garrison was overwhelmed. In desperation, the 501st formed defensive perimeters around the generator station, deploying counter-traps and fallback positions. But the terrain, the unexpected ferocity of the resistance, and the sabotage from within sealed their fate. As rebel saboteurs planted charges and the shields fell, orbital records captured brief flashes of blue-striped armor, disappearing into the smoke, last stands made at doorways, and blaster fire exchanged at brutal close quarters. When the generator exploded and the Death Star itself was destroyed, the Empire was broken. What remained of the 501st vanished with it. What happened to the surviving members of Vader's Fist remains one of the great mysteries of Imperial military history. Officially, the 501st was dissolved with the Empire's collapse. But survivor testimony from scattered warlords and post-Endor outposts tells a more fragmented story. Some squads are said to have gone rogue, disappearing into the Outer Rim to act as mercenaries or enforcers for fractured Moffs. Others may have been absorbed into early First Order projects, their identities scrubbed and rewritten. There are persistent rumors of a group of 501st survivors who refused to accept the war's end, continuing to enforce Imperial law on isolated worlds under the belief that the Emperor would return. One tale speaks of a small unit, still in blue-stripe armor, defending an abandoned outpost on the edge of wild space, awaiting orders that would never come. Whatever the truth, the legend of the 501st endures. They began as clones, brothers bred for battle, fighting for a republic that did not last. They became enforcers of an empire built on silence and fear, hunting shadows and destroying the remnants of what they had once protected. And in the end, they were warriors with no home, no command, and no future. But they never stopped marching. From Scarif's beaches to Endor's forests, from the halls of the Jedi Temple to the corridors of the Death Star, they left behind footprints burned into galactic memory. They were the edge of the blade, the point of no return. Vader's fist, the last hand of the old order. And even in ruin, they remained what they had always been, soldiers to the end. Chapter 10. Legacy of the 501st. The story of the 501st Legion did not end with fire or ceremony. It ended with silence. In the aftermath of Endor, as the Empire fractured and scattered into warlord fiefdoms, and as the New Republic scrambled to secure peace from the bones of rebellion, there were no parades, no final roll calls, no official declaration marking the disbandment of Vader's fist. Like so many instruments of the Emperor's will, the 501st vanished into shadow, their story sealed behind layers of classified archives, redacted war logs, and propaganda so deeply rooted in galactic culture that separating myth from memory became almost impossible. And yet, traces remained. In whispers, in war stories, in the unlikeliest of places, their legacy persisted, not just in what they had done, but in what they had been forced to become. Some veterans survived. Captain Rex, once the soul of the Legion, escaped the trap of Order 66 with his mind intact and his conscience scarred. Though removed from the 501st before its darkest chapters under the Empire, his connection to the Legion remained etched into him like carbon scoring on his armor. He would fight alongside rebel operatives decades later, on distant battlefields and against long odds, wearing a mismatched set of gear, his face older, heavier, but unmistakably the same. Though records were unclear, rebel historians have long speculated that the white-bearded trooper seen fighting on the forest moon of Endor, known only by the alias Nick Sant, was none other than Rex himself. Whether true or not, the symbolism was powerful, that one of the first soldiers of the Republic stood at the final battle that brought the Empire to its knees. Apo, a name remembered with unease, took a different path. Promoted quickly after the siege of Mandalore and present during the march on the Jedi Temple, Apo embodied the transformation of the 501st into the Empire's hammer. His faith in the system endured longer than most, perhaps because he never looked back. He was a soldier in the purest sense, obedient, ruthless, professional. But even Apo's fate is uncertain. Some say he died in a failed campaign on the Mid-Rim. Others claim he was reassigned to intelligence operations, his name erased and his number reissued to a conscript decades his junior. Like so many clones, he became a ghost in the system, his story buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and denial. Then there were the others, those nameless, voiceless survivors whose stories were never recorded. They lived quietly on fringe worlds, hiding their origins beneath rusted helmets and old scars. Some became mercenaries, others farmers, drinking away memories that never faded. The acceleration in their aging meant that few made it far into the New Republic era. But on occasion, someone would recognize the bearing, the posture, the way a man's hand hovered near his belt when danger stirred. And someone would ask, "Were you 501st?" And the old soldier would only nod, as if that were answer enough. Among Imperial officers, even in the later years, the 501st retained mythic status. Academy cadets studied their tactics at Coralag and Prefspelt 4. Naval instructors spoke of their precision, their discipline, their loyalty to Lord Vader as if invoking spirits from another age. Most had never seen them. Fewer still understood them. But every trooper who donned the white armor of the Stormtrooper Corps knew the stories. The ones who breached the Jedi Temple. The ones who never missed. The ones who marched with the Dark Lord himself. New recruits idolized them, not for who they had been, but for what the Empire claimed they were. They became a legend forged in terror and twisted into pride. Even in the wake of the Empire's fall, the 501st shadow loomed large. Legacy units appeared within the Imperial remnant, task forces that adopted the blue markings in honor of the old Legion, often with none of the discipline or ethics of the original. The First Order, in its obsession with reclaiming the Empire's legacy, sought to emulate the 501st structure. Elements of its elite Stormtrooper Corps were trained using modified versions of clone combat doctrine, adapted for a new generation of abducted soldiers who never knew freedom or brotherhood. The name Vader's Fist was used as a rallying cry in private rituals, invoked in holotraining programs and internal propaganda. But it was an echo, louder perhaps, but hollow. The clones were gone. The soul was gone. All that remained was the armor and the fear it inspired. As time passed, the truth of the 501st was slowly buried under layers of retelling. Imperial propagandists immortalized them as flawless warriors, paragons of loyalty and precision. Rebel commentators, seeking to vilify the regime, painted them as unfeeling monsters, no more human than the droids they once fought. The complexity was lost. The The tragedy was forgotten, that these were men bred for war, indoctrinated from birth, given no choice in the sides they served, that they were capable of laughter, loyalty, kindness, and horror. The duality of their legacy made them difficult to discuss in the open. And so the galaxy did what it always did with inconvenient truth. It turned them into myth. Still, there were those who remembered. On Corellia, a small museum tucked into a back alley near Coronet displayed an unpainted clone helmet labeled only CT Unknown. On Naboo, veterans of the local militia still told tales of the blue-striped soldiers who had once protected the royal family during separatist plots, never knowing their names but always remembering their discipline. On Kamino, before the Empire erased the facility, there was a wall in one of the training halls where clone cadets had once etched names into the Durasteel, side by side, row after row. It was the only memorial they had, and when it was finally submerged beneath the rising sea, no one was left to remember what each name had meant. In the years following the Empire's collapse, rebel historians attempted to piece together the truth. Some interviewed surviving clones. Others dug through fragmented Imperial databanks, salvaged from battlefields and crashed Star Destroyers. What they found was incomplete, a scatter of reports, video fragments, testimony redacted or corrupted. But one thing emerged clearly. The 501st had never been one thing. It had been many. A sword, a shield, a brotherhood, a hammer, a tragedy. The men within it were shaped by war and used by powers that never truly saw them as individuals. Yet they had persisted, adapting again and again until there was nothing left to adapt to. Former Imperials spoke of them in hushed tones. One intelligence officer, debriefed by New Republic agents, said simply, they were the best. Not because they were stronger, but because they remembered. Every loss, every betrayal, every time they were ordered to kill something they once protected. A clone descendant on Lothal, raised by a veteran who never gave his real name, recalled waking to nightmares of blaster fire and screams in languages he couldn't understand. And yet, his guardian never stopped polishing the old armor, even when his hands shook and his breath failed. What remains of the 501st today is not a legion, not a unit, not even a name. It is a feeling, a story passed between soldiers, a silhouette in a dusty corridor, a glint of blue paint beneath a layer of soot. It is the knowledge that in the darkest hours of the galaxy's history, there were those who followed orders not because they believed, but because they had been given no other way to live. And some, just a few, who broke free of those chains and chose another path. In the final analysis, the legacy of the 501st is not one of victory or defeat. It is one of endurance. They were created to fight and to die. But they did more. They remembered. They adapted. They survived. And in doing so, they became more than what they were made to be. They became legends, not because of what they did, but because of who they tried to be in a galaxy that never let them. From the sterile halls of Kamino to the blood-soaked forests of Endor, the 501st walked through history not as conquerors or villains, but as men trying to be something more than the numbers on their helmets. And in that, they succeeded.